Listen, a billionaire slaps a leader in a glittering hall, and the whole world finally wakes up. You won't be able to unsee what happens next. This is Traore versus America. I'm your narrator. Today's story is about one hand, one face, and a continent that decided it had been patient long enough. It's about dignity, theft, and a refusal to let history roll on as if nothing was stolen. Stick around. We're peeling back the curtain on how one moment can flip the script on centuries of silence. Picture a ballroom full of glass chandeliers and suits that cost more than a village school. Reporters, cameras, and polite applause. Then a man in a designer suit, comfortable in a world that has always said he's owed everything, stands and crosses a line. He calls the African leader something small and ugly. The room swallows. The cameras roll. Then the billionaire raises his hand and strikes. Snap. Like the cut that begins every viral clip. Heads turn. Phones go vertical. Editors lean forward. In 1,000 living rooms, people gasp. But what the cameras showed was only the final beat of a much longer story. The public punctuation on a private, generational theft. The slap didn't create the injustice. It exposed it. Hold that image. A hand, a flash of white, a cheek. Now rewind 3 decades. That's where this really begins. When the bulldozers arrived, they announced themselves with noise and contracts signed in other capitals. They came with promises and engineers and men who spoke a language of permits and compensation. They left with gold in armored trucks and villages that looked like they'd been erased from memory. Our leader grew up with that noise in his ears, the sound of trees being cut down, of wells running gray. He watched children's futures get traded for minimal wages and big suits. The families kept the photos, green fields, fruit trees, a market full of calling voices. The photos yellowed. The promises didn't arrive. He studied the contracts. He memorized clauses like a chess player reads a board. How many T's had been crossed? How many signatures had names no one remembered? How profits were accounted for, and people weren't. He cataloged schoolrooms that existed only on paper and hospitals that were never finished. He saw rivers die. He saw men return from the mines with nothing left but broken bodies and the guilt of surviving. That history sat behind his eyes the night he walked into the conference hall. The slap was the event. The crime was the pattern. He didn't respond with fists. He didn't throw a punch into the marble that glittered under the chandeliers. Instead, he did something the cameras almost missed. He touched his cheek, slow and deliberate, and then looked the man in the eye. There's a kind of power in not answering violence with the same currency. It's a power that says, you cannot define my response. You cannot make me small on your terms. The silence after that touch was electric. Security moved with rehearsed panic. Reporters shouted questions. Live streams multiplied like sparks. For all the force in that slap, the response that followed was quiet, measured, and it refused to be reduced to mere spectacle. He took the helicopter straight home, the suit creased, the cheeks still hot. The village waited. His grandmother at the landing field, elders who had watched the land stealers come and never go to jail, children who played under trees half remembered by history books. No parade, no victory lap. A meeting under a baobab tree that had scars older than the corporation's logo. They brought the paper, maps, deeds, guarantees that had sounded promising until the ink dried and the promises evaporated. A school that was supposed to be built, not there. A clinic listed on the ledger, never funded. A reclamation plan that never materialized. Why? His grandmother asked him with the quiet of someone who'd watched the world move on without her. Will they not give us back what they took? He didn't answer like a politician. He answered like someone who'd been raised on this soil. He promised, not in speeches, but in a vow that carried the weight of a lifetime, we will make this right. This is the math that rarely makes evening news. Find the poorest region with the richest seam. Negotiate with a few officials. Set up extraction. Export the raw material. Pay a fraction of it back in projects that cost a lot on paper and deliver little in reality. Repeat across decades. When you chart out the flow of wealth, the numbers are brutal and simple. Billions of value leave. Millions in benefit trickle back. Rivers are poisoned. Schools are promises in contracts. Health clinics exist on spreadsheets. He had the spreadsheets. He had the testimonies. He had the man who worked in the mine for 23 years and couldn't afford medicine when his wife got sick. He had the photograph of a village before mining. Kids in mango trees, women carrying buckets, elders smiling. The photograph became a mission. After the slap, the media industrial machine scrolled into action. Headlines rushed in, hungry for sound bites. Stability in doubt, temperament questioned, incident at summit. The talking heads had their scripts ready. A neat package about volatility. Convenient, because it packaged the moment in a frame that didn't explain the years of pillaging that came before. But then a young journalist with a phone did something the big outlets had missed. She streamed the buildup. Virtually no one in the ballroom had her angle. Her video showed the words, the gestures, the contempt that came before the hand connected with the face. Her caption was simple. Here's what they don't want you to see. When millions saw it, the frame shifted. Suddenly, the story wasn't about one leader's reaction, but about the provocation that came before. The narrative changed from instability to arrogance. A continent is more than its politicians. It's poets, muralists, students, and tailors. That's where real movements are born. Murals of the leader's steady face went up in cities. Enormous, defiant portraits painted over walls that once advertised luxury products shipped from the very places that had been stripped. Musicians sampled the live-stream audio into protest songs. Dancers staged pieces where one figure stood still while chaos whirled around him, turning humiliation into choreography. Students in capital cities took to streets and public squares. Designers sold shirts with slogans that raised funds for legal cases. Activists organized boycotts of companies tied to the extraction industry. Small actions fed one another like kindling. This wasn't a single nation's movement. It caught fire across borders. Solidarity doesn't need visas. Then a story surfaced that owned the narrative. A journalist in Europe, the daughter of a man whose businesses were named on contracts and bank statements, found a folder in her father's study and did what integrity demands. She wrote a piece that read like a confession and a legal indictment at once. Emails, contracts, and bank transactions that connected the dots. Money moved, promises broken, officials paid. When the expose ran, regulators and prosecutors in several countries opened investigations. Wealth was traced. Contracts that once seemed untouchable came under a microscope. It's a rare thing when the child of privilege chooses the truth over inheritance. It's rarer still when that truth becomes the lever for accountability across continents. The summit halls watched nervously. Heads of state convened. For years, nations negotiated separately, which is precisely how these deals stayed tilted in favor of the well-resourced companies. But the slap had an unexpected aftertaste: unity. Leaders started talking as a bloc. Legal frameworks were drafted. Unified bargaining power made the old contracts look like relics written in a different era, one where colonial terms still had power. New agreements were framed around local processing, environmental standards, and community ownership percentages. This was not charity. It was leverage. When legal pressure and global scrutiny converged, the billionaire's world crumbled. Investigations, frozen accounts, and lawsuits piled up. The man who had believed himself untouchable faced charges, and the prospect of seeing his fortune repurposed as reparations to people whose names he had never learned. Justice in this story wasn't revenge. It was accounting. What made the victory different was the focus on repair. Schools were rebuilt, but not by contractors who flew in for a quarter, by local builders and craftsmen. Hospitals were funded with transparency committees that included villagers. Land deeds were returned wherever legal review found they had been obtained by coercion or corruption. Reparations took forms that mattered: clean water systems, community-owned processing plants, scholarships for children from impacted zones, and funds to restore ecosystems. The money didn't disappear into grand palaces. It stayed close to where the spoils had been taken, changing lives in ways spreadsheets couldn't always capture. The captain, the leader at the heart of the SLAP, wrote a letter. He forgave, not because he was naive, not because he believed in the purity of moral absolution. He forgave with the clarity of someone who understood that harnessing rage can either build walls or bridges. His forgiveness said, "We will use the law. We will use evidence. We will seek accountability. But we will not become the thing that harmed us." That decision disarmed his critics and made his position morally unassailable. People ask, why forgive? He answered with a short line, "Hatred is a chain I refuse to wear." They built a monument from pieces of mining equipment. Twisted conveyor belts reshaped into hands rising from the earth, palms open in claim, not supplication. It stood in a public square, visible from the road where trucks once left with the country's treasure. Around it, children played. The plaque read, "Stolen Futures Reclaimed." It's a powerful image. Where machines once took, their bones now broadcast the refusal to tolerate theft of land and dignity. Change like this doesn't happen overnight. It happens when a movement frames inconvenience for the powerful into unbearable cost. It happens when a viral clip meets investigative journalism, when art meets law, when local organizers across borders coordinate, and it happens when a leader chooses restraint over reaction, turning humiliation into strategy. There was no single hero. There was 1,000 small ones. The grandmother who kept a photograph, the journalist with a phone, the whistleblower who chose truth over family fortune, the blacksmith who forged tools from abandoned metal. The SLAP did one thing. It concentrated attention. But attention needed action. The rest came from relentless follow-through, from courtrooms and community meetings and long, boring paperwork that finally put teeth under the slogans. If you're watching in the United States, there are a few things to take home. 1. Power hides in paper and routine. It isn't always obvious. The look of a contract can be clean. The consequences are not. 2. Solidarity matters. A cluster of nations bargaining together changed the economics of extraction. We've seen similar power in labor movements, when individual workers unite and move from bargaining in isolation to coordinated action. 3. Narrative is everything. The first version of any story tends to be the one told by the powerful. Counter-narratives, citizen videos, independent journalism, art shift perception, and perception shifts policy. 4. Restraint is a strategy. It's not weakness. It can be the sharpest weapon in politics because it reframes the moral ledger. The measure of justice here wasn't simply the fall of a man. It was the restoration of daily life for people whose days had been poisoned by decisions made in other capitals. It was the sound of children laughing again beside clean water. It was the blacksmith teaching a trade to the next generation. It was the grandmother who finally had a clinic nearby. We tell big stories because they hold a mirror. What seems remote is often local for someone. The same equations of extraction operate in ways, big and small, around the world. This story isn't a neat victory. It's messy. Some companies restructured and stayed. Some officials were replaced only to be replaced again. A legal system can be imperfect. External actors have their own agendas. But even messy victories matter. Reforms stuck in place are better than slick promises. When communities reclaim agency, when they control resource processing, when transparency becomes the norm, that's durable change. One simple act, refusing to reciprocate the slap, rewired the moral conversation. Imagine if every time an injustice happens, the injured party always responded in the expected way. The pattern would lock. When the response breaks pattern, the story widens. For leaders and citizens alike, the lesson is you control the narrative more than you think. The right action at the right time can change not only headlines but laws. So what does this mean for us? It means dignity can be strategic. It means patience can be transformed into power. It means a single act of cruelty can be the spark for an entire movement if people are ready to connect the dots. This story isn't just about Africa. It's about anyone who's been told their land, labor, or voice is expendable. It's about the ways power protects itself, and how an exposed system becomes vulnerable to justice. Now tell me, what actual moment of dignity changed everything in your life? A time when you refused to play small, when you chose restraint or courage, and the world shifted because of it. Drop that story in the comments. Argue with me. Defend your side. Call out the parts you don't agree with. If this moved you, hit subscribe for more deep dives that turn headlines into history. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that dignity can be the most effective kind of resistance, which mattered more in this story, the slap that exposed injustice, or the years of quiet persistence that followed. Pick a side. Start the debate. I'll be reading,